All right, as we've been talking for the last few days about the USSR and the United States and the Cold War, we also mentioned that communism had started to spread southward, especially into Southeast Asia. And we saw that there was the creation of SEATO, the Southeast Asian Treaty Organization, that tried to stop the spread of communism. And we do know that they went into Korea, Vietnam, Laos, Cambodia, those sorts of places to win over, especially the northern halves of those countries. And so that's what we're going to focus on today is the Korean War. And really what we're going to talk about how America goes from being in a Cold War to actually being in a hot war, in a war zone. Although this was never really truly classified as a war, America never declared war on Korea or North Korea. It was actually seen as a police action. America did send a bunch of troops, and we do have veterans that saw a lot of action there. So the first thing to make mention of is a little bit about the Korean history. And so as you can read there, since the beginning of the 20th century, Korea had been a part of the Japanese Empire. However, when World War II happened and Japan is bombed by the atomic bomb at Hiroshima and Nagasaki, America ends up splitting up a lot of its territory with other victors like the Soviet Union, which means that the Soviet Union take over and leaders who are sympathetic to them take over in North Korea and North Vietnam. Whereas in most of the islands around Japan, America actually controls those. And so we see this East versus West with American-supported leaders in South Vietnam and South Korea and communist or socialist leaders in North Korea and North Vietnam. And an example of that would be Ho Chi Minh in North Vietnam and Syngman Rhee in South Korea. So after Japan had the atomic bomb, we talked about how two young U.S. aides come to Korea, and they decide to divide it along the 13th parallel. And we see a lot of dividing of prize land or land that was won during the war by the Soviet Union and America, and here's no difference. So we're seeing, as you can see here, South Korea, right, being controlled by America, North Korea being controlled by the Soviets, Syngman Rhee in the south, and Yoon being controlling in the north, being supported by the Americans and the Soviets, which is important because what you see is that two new nations have formed with two completely different ideals, especially in terms of politics. So we have one that's supported by free enterprise, similar to what's going on in Japan, similar to what's going on in South Vietnam, and the other is being controlled by the communist or Soviets and being supported by the Soviet Union. So I mentioned Syngman Rhee before. He's the anti-communist dictator of South Korea. He really enjoyed the support of America. So he would be what we would call a puppet president or a puppet government because he's really being told what to do by America and benefit for himself and his people. While in the north, we had the communist leader Kim Il-sung, which I mentioned before, and he enjoys a lot of support from the Soviets. And so at this point in time, we know that Sung and Rhee are on different paths, especially with their support. Now, in terms of fighting the spread of communism, America knows it has to kind of build up South Korea. And you'll notice up here next to the Time magazine, there's an interesting note here. This man, Kim Il-sung, is actually the grandfather of the modern dictator in North Korea, Kim Jong-sung, and he's also the father of Kim Jong-il. So when you look at those two, Un and Il, we know their father and son, right? They came from this man who had started communism in North Korea following the fall of its colonial time period. Okay, so nonetheless, neither of them were willing to remain on their side of the 38th parallel. And what that leads to is a lot of skirmishes. Now, Korea is different in terms of its climate. It has a tropical climate in the south. In the north, it's very mountainous and snowy. And so that made it very hard for soldiers on both sides to actually move at things. So the 38th parallel, where it was more of a temperate climate, kind of like what we see here in Iowa, the soldiers were able to stay with their battle plans and fight each other. And we actually saw that 10,000 of them were killed before the Korean police conflict or the Korean War ever officially starts in 1951. And so 5 years of this border dispute um, really starts to make America become alarmed, to the point that in 1950, America decides to start sending in some military advisors. And the reason for that is because there was a dispute. There were two dictatorships on either side of the globe. We have the Soviet Union, which is run by a dictatorship. We also have North and South Korea, as well as we're starting to see a lot of that happen in the Central American countries, and soon going to happen in Cuba. And so what America feared, and President Truman feared at this point, was that there was going to be a communist takeover. And that there was a big time concern, especially with Truman leaving office, that communism was going to run rampant. And Eisenhower, who had been the hero of D-Day, had been a World War II kind of figurehead, wasn't about to let that happen on his presidential watch. So, isolation was not a way to contain communism. And so what America's thought was, and what they felt like they needed to do, was to go in and set up some sort of perimeter, some sort of military enforcement that would kind of keep the North Koreans in North Korea and train the South Korean army. And as you can see from this New York Times from 1950, Harry Truman orders U.S. Air and Navy units to fight in aid of Korea. So Truman sends them, very similar to what JFK does during the Bay of Pigs invasion, and he sends troops to train the Koreans. Little does he know that within a year or so, America is going to be at war and having thousands of men killed. So, America actually does get involved. We can see here Douglas MacArthur shows back up. South Korea was already pressed, had already gone really far into the north. And you can see that highlighted here by the blue. So you can see that North Korea, even before America had a lot of troops on the ground, the Korean army was doing a really great job using the American tactics. However, Douglas MacArthur shows up, and he's told that he needs to recapture Seoul, because as you can see, they did get far here in the blue, but they were pushed back by these reds all the way down here to Seoul. And MacArthur is told, that's your job. Your job is to go there and take back over the South Korean capital so that America still has somewhere to send aid and have that puppet government. At first, the war became defensive, a war to get the communists out of South Korea, and it didn't go so great initially. The North Korean armies were well disciplined, they were well equipped, they had tanks that came from the Soviets, they had machine guns that came from the Chinese, whereas the South Koreans were very nervous and scared at first. And they didn't really stand and fight. They tended to run off. And so it's really important here that America starts to send more troops, or the Korean Peninsula is going to be overrun by the communists from the north. So, during this time period, it's very hot, it's very dry. American soldiers were forced to drink water from rice paddies that had human waste as fertilizer. There was a lot of illness that went around, those sort of things that you get, like E. coli and that sort of thing. And so all of a sudden, American soldiers aren't able to do what they could have done because of these illnesses and because of the lack of supplies. And that was a big deal because it really gave a boost to the North Koreans. And what we also find is that because of the weather, because of the terrain, it's a lot different than fighting in Japan, right? So you went from these hot, dry summers, these cold, snowy winters, which was much different than what most of these troops had faced in the South Pacific during World War II. And so they struggle through the summer. President Truman and Douglas MacArthur, we know MacArthur from World War II. We also know him from World War I. They decided they were going to set some new aims for the war. And the first one was to make it offensive. So they're no longer going to sit back on their heels and let the North Koreans bring the war to them. What they wanted to do was liberate the North from communism. And so MacArthur and Truman's new plan is over here. You can see it, right? Let them infiltrate the South. We have Navy support. We have invading troops that will come into the South to wipe this out. We're going to focus our attention on the North and capturing the North's capital. And by doing that, the hope was that they could sue for peace. MacArthur's hope was that he could drive them all the way to China. Truman and Eisenhower do not agree with that. So the strategy was successful. A land and sea assault were both put in at Incheon, which is a place that you can see here is next or close to Seoul in the 38th parallel. American troops do cross over and head towards the Yalu River, the border between Korea, right here, and China. And the Chinese are told, or do tell, the Americans, if you come too much farther and you get into China, we're going to send an armed aggression towards you. We're going to send troops. MacArthur says, I don't believe it. It's not going to happen. Truman and Eisenhower tell him, you need to be careful. We don't agree with what you're doing. And he said, America doesn't back down. We're going to stop the spread of communism right now. And he ends up making a really bad choice. So Mao, who we talked about earlier this week, Mao has brought communism to China. And he keeps telling America, stay away from the Yalu River. If you come across or you get much closer, we are going to wage full-scale war on you. Truman said that we don't want this. Eisenhower, we don't want this. MacArthur says it's appeasement. It's the same thing we did with Hitler. We need to squash North Korea. And so he continues to press forward. And what he's going to find out is that Mao wasn't lying. Mao sends about 1 million troops from China to help aid the North Koreans. And so Truman, still looking for that way to prevent war, tells MacArthur that you're fired. And so on April 11th, 1951, MacArthur is fired. And to him, that's a slap in the face. To him, that's this demotion. He's always been a military man. He's always protected America. And so what Truman does is he ends up putting into office new military commanders, and they start to have some peace talks at Panmunjom as fighting continues along the 38th parallel. If you're familiar with the TV show MASH, you probably have heard some of these names or these terms before. Finally, there's 2 more years of fighting, and you can see that here on the map, right, it ends up, the 38th parallel is what ends up dividing North and South Korea, even to this day. There's an armistice signed on July 27, 1953. It agrees that South Korea is going to give up 1,500 additional square miles of territory to build a demilitarized zone that's still there. You've probably heard about some of the people who have been taken captive in North Korea, journalists, things like that, because they've crossed into that demilitarized zone. And they've captured them. They put them on trial. They've called them traitors. They've called them invaders, that kind of thing. So it's something that we don't take lightly even to this day. So the legacy of the Korean War is really the war that splits Vietnam and World War II. So for a lot of our soldiers that were part of the Greatest Generation, that were part of Vietnam, because they were young soldiers during the first part of Korea, many soldiers either serve in Korea and Vietnam, or they serve early on in their military service in World War II and back it up in Korea. So we see this as the kind of the first hot conflict of the war. Examples like MacArthur, right? He served in World War I, World War II, and the Korean War. We also see people like Ted Williams, who flew fighter missions in World War II and Korea. We see people like John McCain, who served some time during the Korean War and then again in Vietnam. So although the Korean War was relatively short, it was exceptionally bloody and gruesome. Nearly 5 million people died. That was about 10% of Korea's pre-war population that were civilians. So what we start to see is a movement from soldier to soldier fighting to a spread of killing of civilians, which we're going to see continue all across Southeast Asia, especially in Vietnam. So you can see here there were 40,000 Americans that died, 100,000 were wounded. The United States spent $67 billion fighting the Korean War, and it didn't do anything. It didn't really change anything at all. All it did was kept a close alliance between now Russia and North Korea through Kim Jong-un and Kim Jong-il because of their father, Kim Il-sung, and grandfather. So what it's done is it's allowed, first of all, it was Stalin and Sung. Then we get Khrushchev and Sung. Then we get Gorbachev and Un, and now we have Putin and Il. And it just kind of keeps moving throughout that